Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So today on the channel we have Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, who is an authority and an expert on nuclear weapons, and I guess we'll say geopolitical nuclear strategy. He is the executive director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security, served as director of the U.S. Nuclear Strategy Forum, chief of the staff of the Congressional EMP Commission, and on the staffs of the Congressional Strategic Posture Commission, as well as the House Armed Services Committee and the CIA. So we're going to pick Peter's brain today about all things nuclear conflict, about the conflict that's going on in Europe right now, and how to prepare for it. So Peter, thanks again for coming out. I'm just going to ask you, what is your current assessment of the war in Ukraine?
Well, Russia is winning in one enormously important sense. And that is in the nuclear dimension of this conflict. You know, as I argued in my essay, nuclear war can be won and lost, that nuclear weapons matter, that every war that's fought in the shadow of nuclear weapons is in effect a nuclear war. And Russia, in a way, as Colonist Gray would have argued, the late great Colonist Gray, who was a British strategic thinker, argued that every war fought since 1945 was basically a nuclear war. And so, even though the Russians appear to be, according to the mainstream media, according to everything we're being told on television, even though they're doing really abysmally, and that their conventional forces just don't seem to be up to snuff, nonetheless, we are deterred from entering that conflict more aggressively and providing the necessary aid to Ukraine to put them over the top so that they can win by the nuclear threats that are coming out of Russia. And this is educating Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, all the bad guys about the efficacy of nuclear weapons, nuclear blackmail, nuclear deterrence, that simply by existing, the nuclear weapons give you a tremendous benefit and potentially a tremendous benefit. So I would argue where Russia is concerned, from their point of view, the most important thing, the thing that makes them a superpower, is their nuclear capabilities. And the fact that those nuclear capabilities are proving to be so valuable is an enormous victory for them. Now, on the battlefield, I think we may have talked about it last time, we need to be enormously skeptical about what we're being told by the Ukrainian government and and the US government. I think the Russians are winning. And they're winning not just at the nuclear level, but they're winning in terms of the will of the political alliance that is NATO to back the Ukrainians. We basically drew a line in the sand. There are many strategists who are saying, well, if we're not willing to go all in to defend Ukraine, would we be willing to go all in to defend Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia? The credibility of the NATO alliance itself is on the line in Ukraine because Washington made the mistake of making Ukraine such a big deal in terms of our Western national security. I don't think we should have done it, but we did. And now that we have done that, every day that goes by where Russia does not lose, and in fact, in the eastern provinces, it appears to be on the threshold of achieving victory, even according to the mainstream reporting. That's very bad for us. It means their aggression is being rewarded. And this is noted by all over the world. It has ramifications not just for Europe, but also for the Pacific and the Middle East.
And how could we have entered this war without it escalating into a nuclear conflict? Like, what options would NATO have had other than fighting by proxy?
They offered a 6-point peace treaty. Most of the provisions of that treaty should have been acceptable to us, and it would actually have been in our larger national security interests. For example, we should not have been ambiguous about Ukraine not becoming a NATO member. We should have said, even though Ukraine is a member of the Partnership for Peace, we don't plan to let them in, and we will agree that if you don't invade Ukraine, you're not going to become a member of NATO. We should have agreed that we're not going to expand NATO further eastward, so that Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and South Ossetia and Georgia, all of whom are also Partnership for Peace countries, and Russia is very concerned about them becoming NATO members eventually, they are not going to become NATO members. I think that should have been an easy do for us, because I don't think it's in the interests of Western Europe or the United States to promise that we're going to go to nuclear war for Kazakhstan and for these other countries that are not yet NATO member states. So there were 6 key provisions, and at least those 2 should have been easy, but we didn't agree to any of them. And it's possible. I mean, what Washington says is even if we had agreed to the terms that Russia had offered, they still would have invaded anyway. And maybe that's true, but the fact of the matter is we didn't give peace a chance in terms of negotiating those agreements. And had we done so, then we would know for sure that, Putin is Hitler and there's no negotiating with him. And the high-blown rhetoric that we're using now. So the best way would have been to achieve peace before the war happened. Now that the war is going on, we're not helpless. The Biden administration and our NATO allies, should demarche Moscow and say, look, the nuclear escalatory possibilities in Ukraine, we take your nuclear threat seriously, and we should. We don't want a nuclear war with you. You don't want a nuclear war with us. Let's solve this problem. Let's go back to negotiating a peace in Ukraine based on the terms of the treaty that you originally offered. Now, that's going to be harder to do because Russia's not going to want to give up, the parts of Ukraine, especially the eastern provinces that have spent so much blood and treasure conquering. Also, Russia probably, we hear about all the setbacks Russia is suffering and all the damage that's being done to the Russian military, but we hear very little. It's as if the Ukrainian army is untouched, and that's not true. They must be suffering tremendous casualties. We know that they're running out of all kinds of material. They could be on the verge of collapse. The fog of war is very thick in Ukraine. There's a lot of wishful thinking going on in the West. People think that we can teach Russia a lesson and give them more than a bloody nose. Teach them never to be an aggressor again. But they could be mistaken about that. The Russians, they may be evaluating that the Ukrainian army is on the verge of collapse. The way wars tend to work, when an army collapses, the country can be occupied, the whole country, very quickly. Think about Nazi Germany at the end of World War II. In the last 100 days of the war, when finally the German army basically collapsed and how quickly things came to a terminus. Wars often tend to play out like that. And just because Ukraine appears to be holding its own, at least in the West, today, they're not holding their own anymore in the East. They've been defeated in the East. But we ought not to be counting on the idea that Ukrainians are going to be able to last forever and that we can follow this policy of fighting to the death of the last brave Ukrainian. That's not humane. That's not in Ukraine's interests. It's in all of our interests to try to achieve a negotiated peace there. Maybe we could at least temporarily preserve some of Ukraine if we did it now, before the worst happens to Ukraine. And if we're wrong and the Russians are such a bad basket case in terms of conventional forces, that makes the nuclear threat all the more imminent. And that's the last thing any of us should want.
Yeah, it seems as though the Russians will likely not trust, even if there was a peace agreement with what remains of the rump state of Ukraine. It seems as though the Russians would likely not trust any sort of peace agreement and that things would continue to escalate in the shadows on both sides, that both sides would continue to bolster their defenses and possibly offenses. So my concern would be that even if they did strike a peace deal, it seems as though, like from the Russian point of view, and maybe you could share your thoughts on this, that the only real solution for them is to take the entire country. I can imagine a scenario where they would be concerned that whatever was left of Ukraine would simply rearm and would continue to, I guess, do what was happening since 2014 with the low intensity conflict between like the Donbass and Ukraine, that would kind of play out on a larger scale. So if they were to take the whole country, what do you think happens then? Does Russia, start looking westward from their perspective towards the Baltic states? How do you see this ending? Because, like you say, we can't really do nothing because then that allows the blackmail to prevail. But if we do something, then it escalates into nuclear conflict. If we have a peace agreement, it's likely just going to be buying both sides time. So there doesn't seem to be a way out of this.
Well, you're quite exactly right. The peace agreement I'm calling for, we shouldn't be unrealistic and think that it's going to be a lasting peace. It would be a temporary peace, a peace that we need more than the Russians need, because we need time to rebuild our conventional forces. NATO needs time to build up its conventional forces, and most especially to build up our nuclear forces, to build up our nuclear deterrent. There's an enormous asymmetry favorable to Russia and our nuclear forces now, and this is one of the things that's fueling their aggression. That they have felt free to commit this aggression under the umbrella of their nuclear deterrent. And China and North Korea and Iran could follow suit and do the same thing. So yeah, it would be a temporary peace. And also, I agree with you that the Russians are not going to give up on the idea of taking the whole of Ukraine. That's Putin's imperial ambition. They consider that defensive depth necessary for them historically and in terms of their strategic relationship with NATO, because the fact that we decided not to negotiate a peace in the first place has confirmed, I think, for the Russian general staff and for Putin and for the Russian people too, all their worst fears about what the relationship with Ukraine and NATO was. They were concerned that Ukraine was becoming a de facto member state, even though we hadn't officially allowed them into NATO. And that, in effect, we're acting like they're a de facto NATO member state with all the commitment to them. So they're not going to trust us. The possibility of establishing some kind of a lasting peace before they, even slim as that might have been, maybe Russia would have invaded anyway. But we didn't even take the chance on that, and give peace a chance, as it were. So now, yeah, if we could negotiate a temporary peace to buy time, it doesn't mean the end of Russia's ambitions. I think John Bolton is right that there's going to be what he calls the 30 to 100 year war. Russia, sooner or later, you'll see something like low intensity conflict going on, for years and years, while they try to undermine us and take over what's left of Ukraine. And then their ambition, I think, will be to use Ukraine as a knife aimed at NATO to move their missile armies, to move their air forces, to move their armies after they've reconstituted, rebuilt them, recovered them, so they can reconstitute the kind of threat to NATO that they had during the Cold War, beginning on the border of Ukraine. So this will be aimed at Poland, and they'll have a shared border now. Our most vulnerable NATO member states, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, these countries have never really rebuilt their militaries so that they're very strong. The only way we can really defend them is with the tactical, with the nuclear umbrella. So I think that's where we're heading, and it's the new Cold War. If we're lucky, it'll be a new Cold War and not a new hot war, a World War III. But it's in our interests to buy that time so that we can do things like strengthen now that we've committed ourselves to the defense of the former Warsaw Pact states that were in Eastern Europe, Poland, the Baltic states, and the like. To strengthen them on the ground so that they'll have some kind of a chance of deterring, Russian aggression at the conventional level. When I was in the House Armed Services Committee and responsible for the NATO portfolio, Yeah, I was against expanding NATO to the east, precisely because of this situation. I warned that it would bring on a new Cold War because the Russians would see it as a threat, and it would put us in this very difficult situation because we don't have the means to defend these countries except by nuclear means. They're too close to Russia. Our ability to project power that far out into Russia's backyard is very limited. The NATO member states, even Britain, which has probably got the best power projection capabilities among the European NATO allies, is very limited. They could maybe move 20, 30,000 troops. That's really nothing compared to what the Russians can mobilize close to their borders. So we've created this dilemma for ourselves, and there's really no good solutions. The best of the bad choices right now is to try to get a peace, to stop the nuclear escalatory possibilities. I'm sure there are some people in the Russian general staff right now saying, there are some advocating for tactical nuclear strikes in Ukraine, but there are others who are probably advocating to go big. Let's take advantage of the nuclear superiority we've built up and resolve the problem of the United States and NATO once and for all, by a massive war-winning first strike. I'm sure those voices are also being raised. We need to stop the fighting to avoid those worst case outcomes and buy time for us. The Russians are going to need the time too, because they've discovered that their military, is not as vaunted and as effective as they thought it was. So they're going to need that time too. And we need the time more than they do, to strengthen our position and hopefully be able to avoid a third world war and turn it into just a new Cold War.
I've heard you say in one of your previous interviews that you felt that officially we're at DEFCON 5 still. And to me, if we were serious about defending the Baltic states, because I guess the big concern now is, especially with the Kaliningrad, Lithuania row, that there's a potential there for some sort of escalation between Russia, Belarus, and Lithuania. And if were that to happen, of course, everybody thinks, well, Article 5 would be invoked and, the full force of NATO would come to the rescue. But one of the comments that stood out in our last interview is when you said that that's not a guaranteed thing, and that it's very, people take for granted perhaps this idea that once a NATO country is attacked, we're immediately going to put everything into the fight. Could you see a scenario where Russia did attack a Baltic state or a NATO member, and there was no immediate response because of the fear of nuclear escalation?
Sure, that's been a long-standing concern in the Pentagon, that they might invade the Baltic states. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, they have very shallow defensive depth. Before the Ukrainian war, the estimates were that they could walk over those states in 72 hours. Rand did some nuclear exchange modeling analysis and has made the case that even if we resorted to tactical nuclear weapons, and got in a tactical nuclear war with Russia over the Baltic states, that we would lose. And even with tactical nuclear weapons, we wouldn't be able to win. So that's a very tempting and vulnerable part of NATO that they could go after. And I've long been concerned about the Kaliningrad enclave. Most people don't know about that. It's a part of Russia that is not geographically contiguous to Russia. It's separated, by the Baltic states and by Belarus. And this has always been, if you approach things from the point of view of a geostrategist, nations which have parts of themselves that are disconnected, you don't have a land bridge to that thing, and they are abutting hostile territories, that's always a sign of war. That's always a bad sign. Think of East and West Pakistan, where you had two divided country on either side of hostile India. A a geostrategist would have told you war is inevitable under those circumstances, because the nations like to be geographically contiguous, and they're going to fight to try to make that happen. And that's not the only Russian island. We've got the Russian 14th Army down in Moldova, which in effect is kind of like a Russian province that is not geographically contiguous to Russia. And a lot of analysts thought that if Russia quickly overran Ukraine, their next target, was going to be Moldova, and they were going to grab that part of it, link up with the 14th Army. A cynical person looking at the fact that Russia allowed these enclaves to happen at the end of the Cold War, a cynical person, looking at it from a general staff point of view, might have said, these guys were always planning to come back, that they left these highly, because it's not like these are little peaceful enclaves. Kaliningrad is one of the most heavily armed regions in the world. So was Moldova with the 14th Army. The Russians, before they left, just packed these things with arms so that they could defend these. And they conduct many exercises where they have war scenarios over Kaliningrad or over Moldova. It's almost as if the general staff had planned someday, to come back into these areas and recapture these areas. And these bastion areas were going to help them do that.
Proof of what you're saying is with what we're seeing right now with Crimea, who was somewhat of a, was taken in 2014, and it was not part of the contiguous Russian state. And of course, now they are. They've created that land bridge to them. So it would make perfect sense that at some point, ultimately, that gap between Kaliningrad and Belarus, in the very least, will be bridged. That's a very interesting point you make about how that historically plays out, how it's almost, just a matter of time. Obviously, I would presume that Kaliningrad has some nuclear strategic utility as well, like with respect to the placement of nuclear missiles and defense systems.
Yeah, the Russians have been threatening to put nukes into Kaliningrad recently, but they've already done that. I mean, they Iskander missiles in Kaliningrad. Those have almost certainly got both conventional and nuclear warheads and have had them for a long time. For the propaganda value, they'll raise the specter of putting more nukes or additional nukes. I think just today or this week, they talked about giving Iskanders and tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus on a lie. Belarus can become the land bridge basically to Kaliningrad. But yeah, Kaliningrad is a real threat. It would be one of the ways in which the Russians would be able to pose a threat to the Baltic states and to Poland with those Iskanders, which are extremely accurate, and they can range all over the Baltic states and all over the eastern part of Poland, to put at risk Polish forces that would be deployed in the direction of Russia. So it's an offensive capability they've got in Kaliningrad, not just a defensive capability. In fact, I'd say its chief role has been an offensive capability, which is another sign that they had always tended to come back, and dominate these areas again because of the nature of, they didn't just turn Kaliningrad into a fortress. In the Cold War, they used to call them operational maneuver groups. It was a heavily armed entity that was self-sufficient, that could go in behind enemy lines and tear up command and control systems, damage the forces in their rear areas. And Kaliningrad is like that. It's basically a fortified but operational maneuver group, that can move out with missile fires and aircraft fires, including tactical nuclear fire, against NATO. And in terms of this provocation, alleged provocation that's being done by the Lithuanians, where they're cutting off transport, I don't see that as a true provocation by the Lithuanians. I think the Lithuanians are concerned about their own security, because that's one of the areas where the Russians could strike out and might actually implement this. And a lot of the Western press There's sort of a conspiracy theory out there that, well, that the Biden administration has encouraged the Lithuanians to threaten Kaliningrad so that this will put pressure on the Russians to end the Ukrainian war. You know, that look at, we can threaten Kaliningrad, so that's something very valuable to you. So stop what you're doing in Ukraine. Let's negotiate. I'm not sure the Biden administration, I don't think that's true. I think that's something the Western press has more or less invented. I hope that they're that clever. Okay. I think another alternative explanation for that is that the NATO alliance itself is not as unified as a lot of people think, and that our allies, this has put a tremendous, I think John Bolton is right about this too. I mean, he and I don't agree on everything, but I agree with him that the NATO alliance is inherently very frail. It's very fragile. As long as times were good and they didn't have to spend much on defense, and there was not a high price to be paid in terms of energy and that sort of thing, everything was hunky-dory. But now the NATO alliance is under a lot of pressure. And while there's the public semblance of unity is paper thin, you know, I think there are a lot of differences. The West Europeans, I don't think, want to get dragged into a war with Russia. They would like to end this thing. They would like to start getting energy from Russia again. You know, they don't like the economic sanctions. This is really hurting their economies, and they're terrified of a nuclear war. The East Europeans are concerned about America's long-term commitment to NATO and to defending them. You know, one of the darker scenarios might be that maybe the Lithuanians are being provocative here, you know, because they want the United States to do something and to become more aggressive in the defense of Ukraine, you know, and they may see themselves as having a very limited opportunity to do this because America isn't the economic giant it used to be. It's not the military giant. It's certainly not the nuclear giant it used to be. You know, this is their perhaps a fleeting opportunity for them to get America, the superpower, involved to arrive at some kind of a military settlement that will ensure the future security of these East European countries that Russia wants to reincorporate into their empire. And so maybe they're getting a little aggressive and doing this on their own, you know, to cause problems that could draw in the United States, to create a crisis that might draw in the United States. That's another possibility. So the fog, like I said, the fog of war is very thick, you know, over Ukraine. Is this a gambit from the Biden administration? I doubt it. I haven't seen much evidence that they think that way, but they're chess players. I think this is maybe be something that the Lithuanians are doing on their own for their own self-defense, but also, you know, because they hope that it will lead to the United States becoming more deeply involved in the Ukraine war and more deeply involved in the security of the Balkan states.
It appears as though the EU, the sanctions, the EU is saying, hey, like, we're not saying that, you know, you need to blockade this, but Lithuania is coming back and saying, no, we are, you know, preventing the transport of goods into Kaliningrad. So it appears as though there is a division there amongst what the expectation is about enforcing these sanctions. And, you know, that argument you have about Lithuania potentially using this as a provocation to call more attention to what's going on, because they know that it's perhaps inevitable that Russia will at some point, you know, usurp that whole area, definitely has merit to it. One of the things that have puzzled me about this conflict, and, you know, I think it's puzzled a lot of people, is the Zelensky thing, whatever you want to call it. It's like, why hasn't Kiev been targeted by the Russians? Why are they leaving that window open? Because clearly they could bring more force to bear in Kiev if they wanted to, but for whatever reason, it's almost as if they're allowing this Zelensky campaign to ensue, even though it appears to be to their detriment. Or perhaps I'm mistaken in that I'm overestimating Russia's capabilities in that regard. What do you think the reason is for letting Zelensky do what he's doing from the Russians' point of view?
I know the way that it's been represented in the West is that the Russians are being barbarians and they're, destroying the infrastructure, and that's the impression people get. But that's not really true. I mean, it's well within the capability of the Russians to do to any Ukrainian city what we did to Dresden or Hamburg during World War II. But they haven't done that. I think in their calculations, they want the infrastructure to remain intact. The electric infrastructure, the pipelines that carry natural gas to Eastern and Western Europe, and that have been an important part of not only their revenue, but of their ability, their leverage over Western Europe. In fact, the cutoff of those energies is one of the chief stumbling blocks for NATO. It's one of the chief divisions, over NATO. People are paying lip service to being willing to make this sacrifice, but how long are they really? Look at Americans. How long do we really want to pay more at the pump, for energy prices? Not that our energy prices here in the West and North America are chiefly caused by Putin, as Biden says. That's not so. So it's because of the energy policies the Biden administration, has been pursuing. They also want to, I think, incorporate Ukraine, the Ukrainian people. Part of Putin's motive is his ideology, whether it's accurate or not. He sees Ukraine as a natural part of Russia, and that there are many cultural, linguistic, historical linkages between these people. I don't think he wants to ultimately turn them into a long-term enemy, and so I think the Russians are exercising forbearance and not completely destroying these Ukrainian cities out of their own self-interest. They would like to be able to quickly reconstitute these areas if they can take them over. And they don't want to be fighting a guerrilla war against a population that feels like it's, like they've been conquered by an enemy. Putin would like this war to go the way the Crimean War went, when Russians were actually welcomed into the Crimea, and there was very little opposition. It's not working out that way, but I think he still hopes for that. If he can just eliminate that pesky Ukrainian army and crush the army in the field.
Yeah, it appears as though the Russians are gaining something very valuable. And you talked about it last time with respect to your analysis of the Austerlitz scenario that happened in the Napoleonic Wars, and how perhaps the Russians are using this as a training ground for future engagements. Do you still think that's a possibility here? And what do you think? I guess part of my question would be, how powerful is the Russian military compared to NATO at this stage in the game, compared to maybe where it was back in February?
I definitely think the Austerlitz scenario is something that we definitely need to worry about, especially when it comes to tactical nuclear weapons and chemical and biological nuclear weapons, in which Russia has a unilateral advantage over us. I'm still very concerned the way they're conducting the war may be intended to try to lure us in. And that might be part of the plan. NATO does not have, like I said, that much ability to project force. And if they had a combined US, British, French, what the Germans could send, what little the Germans could send in there, and they wiped that all out in Ukraine as a killing fields, that would make all the sacrifices they're making in Ukraine. And in fact, they would have defeated NATO. They would have dealt us such a blow that we wouldn't be able to recover from it. So I think that's a scenario, especially when you're talking about the use of their unilateral advantage in weapons of mass destruction, especially tactical nuclear weapons, is something that we really need to worry about. And it's another reason why we should not wade any more deeply militarily into the Ukraine war. They could actually be wanting that. What is the relative balance of power? I know the common wisdom in Washington, the dominant view, because most journalists are against U.S. defense spending. They're sort of having a field day over belittling the Russian army and saying, "Oh, look how you guys got it so wrong." The Russian army is just you've exaggerated it. It's not 10 feet tall. So we don't need to spend money on building up our own armed forces, nor do our NATO allies. Nor do we need to catch up with them with tactical nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons, because everybody knows that you can't fight and win a nuclear war. So I'm afraid that exactly the wrong lessons may be being derived from this. And everybody forgets that just last summer, we had an even more humiliating experience at the hands of the Taliban. And it wasn't just the United States, but our NATO allies too. We all got chased out of Afghanistan by the Taliban. The Taliban are even less impressive than the Ukrainian army is. There's a lot of reasons why the Russians haven't done so badly, haven't done well against the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian, in a way, they're fighting themselves. The Ukrainian army is mostly armed with Russian equipment. Their tactics and the way they think is based on Russian doctrine. And, they fight like the Russians, and they knew how the Russians were going to fight them. And Putin wasn't expecting them to fight. So he got taken by surprise. He wasn't able to just walk into the country with the kind of support that he got when he walked into Crimea. And then there's another factor, and it doesn't bode well for us either. I think there's a revolution in military affairs going on in Ukraine that is underappreciated. And we may be seeing the demise of the tank army as the decisive instrument on the modern battlefield. The switchblade munitions that are being used, even the Turkish equivalent of our Predator, these unmanned aerial vehicles. It doesn't seem to matter that the Russians could have air superiority in the way we thought about it during the Cold War, where you have manned jet aircraft dominating the skies at 20,000 feet. The airspace that really matters is a couple of hundred feet off the ground, dominated by subsonic unmanned aerial vehicles that are doing an incredible job blowing up tanks and armored vehicles. You just take that switchblade, it's operated by one guy. It's basically an intelligent anti-tank round, so all the guy has to do is fire it, and then he can scoot, shoot and scoot and move so that they can't even do counter battery fire. And this thing will go out and hunt a tank, and it will go up and then come down to attack the tank from the top, where the armor is thinnest. And this is one of the things that has been so decisive for the Ukrainians, the use of these technologies that have been available provided to them, not just by the United States and other NATO countries, but even by Turkey and Israel, because these technologies are available to mid-level powers and small powers. They don't require a superpower to make them. And we're going to face that same kind of problem in the future battlefield. Now, the Russians, unfortunately, I wrote an article a couple of years ago about the military revolution that happened. I think this first dawned on us during the Nagorno-Karabakh War, when that's a war that had been going on and off between Azerbaijan and Armenia for about 30 years. But the Turks gave the Azeris these unmanned vehicles, and they bought stuff from Israel. And for the first time in history, you had an unmanned air force. For lack of a better term, as a family, they're basically flying killer robots. That's what they are. They're flying killer robots. And for the first time in history, they defeated a manned army, including an army that had supersonic jets and modern air defenses, because those things are not designed for taking out these subsonic pieces of plastic that are stealthy on the cheap because they're almost invisible to radar. So this is another thing that wasn't anticipated by the Russians. I don't think it was anticipated by us either, about how decisive they are. And we will run into this in a future battlefield too, because the Russians have got drones like this, and they can use them against us as well. So I think that's a factor. And then another factor that may not have been taken into account, and I don't know that this is true or not, but when I'm thinking of how the Ukrainian war has unfolded, I keep thinking of the Finnish Winter War in 1940, Baron Karl von Mannerheim. You had a military genius, who really knew how to take advantage of Finland's defensive possibilities in the middle of the winter against the Russian army in 1940. And now the Finns lost that war. They were outnumbered like 20-1 by the Russians, and they gave Stalin a really bloody nose. And it was one of the things that made Hitler think that the Russians were going to be pushovers. And so that was part of his justification for Operation Barbarossa and invading Russia. Because if the Finns could do it, surely the Nazis could do it too. But the Russians learned from that Finnish Winter War. And I hope we're not going to make the same mistake in Ukraine. I mean, it could be that the Ukrainians have got the equivalent of a Robert E. Lee on their general staff, a guy who's really good at counterpunching and defensive warfare. So a lot of what we're seeing may not be that the Russians are so inept, but the Russians have been unlucky because they happen to be fighting a war at the time that there's a military technological revolution that makes the tank obsolete. And because you've got perhaps some on the Ukrainian general staff, a guy who really understands how the Russians fight war, because, you know, they are, in effect, they used to be the Russian army themselves, and knows how to maximize the military capabilities of Ukraine. We might be drawing exactly the wrong conclusion from this, though, and say, oh, the Russians aren't 10 feet tall. Well, we're not 10 feet tall. Maybe we're not 10 feet tall either on paper. We're not even 10 feet tall on paper. And we proved that we're less than 10 feet tall in Afghanistan just recently. I'll tell you, if we were taking the kind of casualties that the Russians were taking in Ukraine, I think we would have sued for peace a long time ago and gotten out of there, because we are, as a strategic culture, very casualty averse and not used to taking that kind of damage. You know, maybe we should be paying more attention to how much blood and treasure and equipment the Russians are willing to give up, you know, and still they persist in this war. That shows a level of commitment that I'm not sure NATO, you know, most of the times in modern wars, the thing that really matters is not technology, but political will. You know, look at the Korean War, okay? Look at the Vietnam War, and look at Afghanistan. Political willpower can compensate for a lot. And if Russia has got the superior political will, because it's so determined, and no matter what the cost, it's going to conquer Ukraine, that's not a guy we want to go to war with, especially when he's got nuclear weapons, vast preponderance in nuclear weapons, vast preponderance in nuclear capabilities. We want to avoid a World War III until we're positioned ourselves to win it by having the capabilities, which we don't have right now, and also by having the political military leadership, which we certainly don't have right now.
Yeah, it seems that as the Russians are expending a large amount of resources and manpower, they're also gaining a lot on the global monetary stage in terms of building relationships with other countries and the rift that's now happening between East and West. And then, of course, if they do take Ukraine over, that apparently they've taken over the parts of the country in which 80% of the resources and industrial activity is. So they're capturing, as much as they're expending manpower and resources, they're also standing to gain a little bit from this as well. And I think the experience they're gaining in modern combat, and I'm sure, you know, NATO intelligence is in there as well, trying to get as much, you know, secondhand information as they can, or firsthand, I guess, depending on how you look at it. You know, they're definitely gaining a lot from this progress, if you want to call it that, that they're making. So I don't think it's certainly not all for naught. Now, what do you think the likelihood, shifting the conversation into discussions about nuclear matters, what do you think the likelihood of a nuclear war occurring is right now?